Okay, so hello and welcome to the third and final video. So in this video, we're going to try and connect our discussion from the previous video where we talked about a firm's production process and how a firm produces its outputs to a discussion about a firm's costs and how much it costs that firm to produce those outputs. So when we talk about costs, we're typically talking about what a firm has to pay to obtain the inputs it needs for its production process. So we typically divide these costs into two categories, variable costs and fixed costs. So variable costs are costs that vary based on how much output a firm produces. So for example, if a firm has to buy more materials or hire more labor to produce more output, then the amount that that firm has to pay to obtain those materials or hire that labor is what's going to fall underneath the variable costs here. So the bottom line would be that variable costs increase if the quantity output also increases. So we also have fixed costs. So fixed costs are costs that do not vary with how much a firm produces. So this would be, for example, if you were talking about a firm that rented a manufacturing facility. So the chances are, regardless of whether that firm actually produces anything, they're still going to have to pay rent every month. So whether it's using that manufacturing facility to manufacture its products, or whether it's letting that facility sit idle, that firm is still going to have to pay rent every month and it's still going to incur fixed costs. So the bottom line here is that fixed costs do not vary with output. So variable costs vary with output, fixed costs do not. So now that we've defined variable costs and fixed costs, how do we connect these two concepts back to our discussion about production from the last video? Well, if you remember, we assumed that we only had two inputs involved in the production process in our previous discussion. So we assumed that we had capital and we had labor. And we further assumed that one of those inputs, capital, was fixed, so that if a firm wanted to increase the amount of output it was producing, it would have to hire more labor. So it should make sense that in our model from our previous video, that the variable costs that firm incurs will be those labor costs that it incurs in hiring more labor to produce more output. So now we have to ask ourselves, how much labor does a firm have to hire to produce a given level of output? And in answering that question, we'll be able to then figure out what the firm's variable costs are. Well, we've already answered that question actually in the last video, whenever we drew this picture. So this picture is basically the total product curve that we drew out last time, where we said that as a firm increases the amount of labor it employs, this is how much output it will produce. So now let's assume that the firm is hiring this labor at a constant wage per worker off the labor market. Then we could use this curve to estimate the variable costs incurred by this firm by simply just sort of looking and saying, okay, well, at a given level of output, how much labor does that firm have to employ? And that would be some number. And then we would multiply that by the wage rate per worker to get the variable costs. And this is something that we did in class. And you can redraw this figure to kind of reflect that fact, the fact that, you multiply the horizontal axis here by the wage rate, and then you flip, so you flip, then you turn, there we go. So you flip and then you turn, so that way now the quantity produced is on the horizontal axis, but your variable costs are on the vertical axis. And so now we see that we have variable costs, because this curve tells us that for how much, for a given level of output, how much labor does it have to employ, and multiply that by the wage rate, and that gives us variable costs. So we can easily turn this variable cost graph into a total cost graph by adding in fixed costs, because if you remember, the formula for total cost is just variable costs plus fixed costs. So we just add in fixed costs, and you'll see that basically just means shifting the vertical intercept of this function up by some amount. And the reason that is because, like we said before, fixed costs do not vary with the level of output. And we can see this here. So this straight line here is our fixed cost, and we can see that regardless of how much we produce, that fixed cost stays the same. So it basically just shifts up this function from, so it was like it intersected the vertical axis at 0 before, and now it intersects it somewhere up here now, because it just the fixed costs just shift this curve up. They don't actually change the slope of the variable cost function. But once we add in those fixed costs, now this becomes the total cost curve. Now we have everything we need to talk about marginal costs, which, if you remember from the first video, that's our, the end goal that we're trying to reach for this series of videos, is to actually reach marginal costs. So we define marginal cost, if you remember, as how much total costs change as we change the level of output. So we can derive the marginal cost curve basically almost the exact same way as we derived the marginal product curve in the last video, which was just by looking at the slope. Because if you look at this definition of marginal cost, this is really just the slope of the total cost curve, because it's saying, okay, well, if you change quantity by, say 1 unit, how much is total cost going to change? So let's take a look here at the total cost curve. So we can kind of see that as you increase production by 1 unit, the marginal cost of increasing that production is getting smaller until some point, which, if you'll remember from the way our graph looked before we flipped it, so this was the way, so this was our total product curve from last time. And if we're just flipping it, then the inflection point here should basically be the same point here. So basically, so our marginal costs are declining up until some point, and this point is actually at the same point where diminishing returns set in on our previous graph from the last video. And so once diminishing returns sets in, then we see this slope start increasing. And so as you increase your output, it starts getting really dramatic, out through here. Whenever the total cost curve starts getting vertical, that as we increase output, the change in total costs gets bigger. And so that's what gives us this U-shaped curve. So like the cost per unit is falling up until this point, where diminishing return sets in, and then marginal costs turn back up, and then they continue to go up. So that is how we derive our marginal cost curve. And now we have half of what we need to apply marginal analysis to a firm's decision-making process, which was the point of these 3 videos, was to get us to this point. So in a sense, we're done, but before we move on, I want to introduce one more concept, because it's going to be very important to our discussion this Friday, whenever we're going to talk about the firm's decision-making process in full with marginal revenue and marginal cost. And we're going to talk about how that differs in both a perfectly competitive setting and a monopolistic setting. But one thing, so in addition to talking about marginal cost, I want to introduce this concept of average cost, because this is going to be particularly important for our discussion, where we bring this all together to derive the supply function in the perfectly competitive model, which again was sort of like one of the major points that we were wanting to get across in this discussion, or rather, at least get to this stepping stone. Like, so we'll have everything we need to talk about that this Friday. So one last thing before I let you go, then, is the concept I wanted to introduce to you was average cost, or excuse me, average variable cost. So average variable cost is defined basically like it sounds. It's the variable cost divided by the total quantity of output. And so we can see that the minimum of this average variable cost curve is going to be found where this curve intersects the marginal cost curve. And the reason this is for basically the same reason. If you remember from our last lab period, we had a similar discussion for the average product curve and the marginal product curve. And so if you'll remember, the peak of the average product curve was found where it intersected the marginal product curve. And so we can have a similar sort of discussion for why the minimum of this average cost curve can be found where it intersects the average cost curve, or excuse me, where it intersects the marginal cost curve. So average cost, the minimum of this curve here, where it intersects marginal cost. So the reason that is because if marginal cost is below average costs, then average costs are falling. And you can take this back to the example that Dr. Hyman presented in class. So for example, so in his example, he talked about your marginal exam grade versus your average test grade over the entire semester. So if your average test grade is a 90, but then on your next exam you make a 60, then that's going to be dragging down your average, which is basically what we see here. So this would be a case where your average is below your marginal, and so long as that is the case, it's dragging down the average. But then if you have an opposite case where, say, for example, if you have an average of, say, a 90, and then on your next test grade you get a 95, it's going to be pulling up your average. And so we see where the marginal cost curve lies above the average variable cost curve, then the average variable cost curve is increasing. So this is the average variable cost curve, and like I said, this will become more important this Friday whenever we talk about how to derive the supply function in a perfectly competitive market. So I just want to make sure that we introduce this before I ended this series of videos. So hopefully these wind up being helpful. In addition to these videos, I'm going to upload a worksheet to provide you with some numerical examples that you can work through to better familiarize yourself with these concepts. So the concepts of marginal product, average product, variable cost, fixed cost, marginal cost, etc. So basically everything that we've talked about in these 3 videos and the last lab that we had. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you guys this Friday. Okay, have a great afternoon, and I hope you had a great fall break. Thanks a lot.